Good evening, and I want to take a few minutes tonight to talk about the midterm elections on November 8th. Now, I know there are a lot of people out there who don't pay much attention to midterm elections. Nobody is running for president. There are not a lot of big debates or national media hoopla. In fact, many Americans don't even know who's running for Congress in their district, or for the US Senate in their state, or for governor. And they're thinking, it's not a presidential election. What's the big deal? Why should I go out and vote? Why should I knock on doors or work on a campaign? Who cares? Well, if you are one of those people, and that's what you're thinking, let me be very clear. You are dead wrong. The election in 5 weeks is the most important midterm election in the modern history of this country, and to a very significant degree will determine the future of the United States of America, and it will have a major impact on your life and the life of your family. Yes, it does matter a whole lot who controls the US Senate and the US House. And let me tell you why. We are living in an unprecedented moment in history and in extraordinarily dangerous and unsettling times. You turn on the news and it looks like it's one crisis on top of another. It's the economy, it's climate change, it's the attack against abortion rights, it's the pandemic, it's the war in Ukraine, and perhaps most importantly, it's the growing effort by Republicans to undermine the very foundations of American democracy. In my view, as we enter the last 5 weeks of this midterm campaign, it's imperative that we not only expose Republicans for their reactionary agenda and the harm they will do to working people and the middle class, to women, to our environment, and to our democracy. That is enormously important. But it's not enough. As progressives, we have got to lay out our agenda, our vision as to where this country should go. And that is to create a government that works for all and not just the few. When we talk about what's going on in this country, let's start off by taking a look at the state of our economy. And what you'll find is that the economy is doing great. It's doing fantastic for the people on top, but not so good for the middle class, for working families, for the vast majority of our people. In case you haven't noticed, you're living in a rigged economy in which the rich and powerful are doing phenomenally well, while working people are falling further and further behind. Today, while some 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, just trying to pay the bills, the billionaire class has never, ever had it so good. Unbelievably, while tens of thousands of workers died going to their jobs during the pandemic, doing what they were asked to do, the billionaire class became $2 trillion richer during that same period. Today, while the price of healthcare is soaring, 3 people, 1, 2, 3, own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, which is 165 million people. 3 people, more wealth than 165 million people. We now have more income and wealth inequality than at any time in the history of our country. Today, while some 18 million American families are paying over 50% of their limited incomes on housing, and 600,000 are homeless, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92% of our people. Today, while Americans struggle to fill up their gas tanks to get to work, CEOs of the largest corporations in our country now make almost 400 times as much as the average worker. Do you hear that? CEOs of the largest corporations now make almost 400 times as much as the average worker. And when we talk about inflation, which is on the minds of almost everybody, let us understand that inflation is a worldwide phenomenon, not just American. In Europe, inflation is now at 10%. In America, while much too high, inflation is at about 8.2%. And when we talk about inflation, here is the ugly truth. Corporate America, with their extraordinary greed, is using the pandemic, the global supply chain crisis, and the horrific war in Ukraine to charge Americans outrageously high prices, all the while they make record-breaking profits. This is what's going on. While the price of gas has soared, the 5 big oil companies made $59 billion in profits during the second quarter of this year alone, 1 quarter. And they're spending $88 billion on stock buybacks and dividends to exclusively benefit their wealthy shareholders. That's the oil companies. While global food prices skyrocketed by over 33% last year and are expected to go up by another 23% this year, billionaires in the global food and agribusiness industry became $382 billion richer during the pandemic. While we continue to pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, 3 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in America, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and AbbVie, increased their profits by 90%, 90% last year to $54 billion. Meanwhile, the CEO of Moderna recently acquired a $926 million golden parachute after his company received $2.5 billion in taxpayer dollars from the Trump administration to develop its COVID vaccine. And while 1 out of 4 Americans could not afford to pay for their prescription drugs, the CEO of Regeneron Pharmaceuticals made over $450 million in total compensation last year. While 46% of Americans either skipped or delayed the health care they need because they just could not afford it, the 6 largest health insurance companies in America last year made over $60 billion in profits. And on and on and on it goes. Americans paying more and more for basic necessities, while corporate greed is at an outrageous and unprecedented level. Now, it is election time, so it is fair to ask what the Republicans want to do to improve the economy and tackle the unprecedented level of corporate greed in America. What's their plan? Well, let me tell you what they want to do. At a time of massive wealth and income inequality, they want to provide trillions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1% and large corporations by making the Trump tax breaks for the rich permanent, and by completely repealing the estate tax, which benefits just the tiny few at the top. At a time when 85 million Americans are either uninsured or underinsured, the Republicans want to throw up to 32 million Americans off of the health care they have and substantially increase premiums by repealing the Affordable Care Act. At a time when half of older Americans have no retirement savings and 55% of seniors are trying to survive on less than $25,000 a year, the Republicans want to cut Social Security and raise the retirement age. At a time when tens of millions of seniors and people with disabilities cannot afford the high cost of dental care, eyeglasses, and hearing aids, The Republicans want to make massive cuts to Medicare. At a time when the cost of prescription drugs continues to soar, the Republicans want to repeal the very modest legislation President Biden recently signed into law that makes sure that no senior in America pays more than $2,000 a year for prescription drugs, and that Medicare finally begins to negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry to bring down drug prices. At a time when the cost of long-term healthcare continues to skyrocket, the Republicans want to make massive cuts to Medicaid, the source of funding for 2/3 of nursing homes in America. While the United States has the highest childhood poverty rate of virtually any major country on earth, the Republicans oppose extending the $300 a month per child tax credit passed in the American Rescue Plan. That's some of what's going on in the economy and Republican response. And then there is the existential threat to our planet of climate change. The latest report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is very clear and it is very foreboding. If the United States, China, India, and the rest of the world do not act extremely aggressively in cutting carbon emissions, our planet will face enormous and irreversible damage. In fact, the world that we will be leaving our children and future generations will be increasingly unhealthy and uninhabitable. Just take a look at what happened in the last few months, past summer, in the United States and around the world. And remember, if we don't act aggressively in transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel, it will only get worse, much worse. But this is what's happened. The past 8 years have been the hottest years in recorded history. The western half of the US is experiencing its worst drought in over 1,200 years. Historic rainfall and devastating floods took place over a 5-week stretch this summer in eastern Kentucky, eastern Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, Death Valley, California, and Dallas, Texas. These are supposed to be 1 in 1,000-year torrential rainfalls. This summer, Europe experienced its worst drought in over 500 years. A massive heat wave in Spain and Portugal killed more than 2,000 people in July alone. Historically hot weather in London and China literally melted bridges, airplane runways, and rooftops. Let me repeat that. The extremely hot weather in London and China this summer literally melted bridges, rooftops, and airplane runways. Record-breaking forest fires in Europe have already burned 1.6 million acres of land, 56% more than the previous record set in 2017. Record-breaking drought in China has caused parts of the Yangtze River to completely dry up. This is the 3rd largest river in the world and the source of drinking water for 400 million people. Catastrophic rainfall and massive floods in Pakistan killed at least 1,200 people and displaced 10 million people, as 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. And if all of that is not enough, a glacier in Antarctica that scientists have dubbed the Doomsday Glacier has been in rapid retreat and is melting much faster than previous predictions. Without this glacier and its supporting ice shelves, sea levels could rise by 3 to 10 feet, which could cause entire coastal communities to flood and go underwater forever. We are talking here about major cities around the United States and across the globe that could be underwater in the coming decades. Think about the mass dislocation, turmoil, and international tensions that these migrations of millions and millions of people will have. And finally, we cannot talk about the devastating effects of climate change without discussing Hurricane Ian, which made landfall in Florida last week with winds close to 155 miles per hour. Ian is exactly the kind of super hurricane scientists have been warning us about, which will happen with more and more frequency if we do not act decisively now. So far, over 100 people are reported dead from that storm, and the damage will cost billions and billions of dollars in repair. And yet, I have to say this, despite all of that, there are virtually no Republicans in Congress who are prepared to take the kind of strong action we need to protect the planet. Sadly, they remain more interested in protecting the profits of the fossil fuel industry than in protecting our planet and the needs of future generations. But it's not just the economy and climate change that we are talking about. Think about the outrageous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in overturning Roe v. Wade, and in the year 2022, telling every woman in this country that she does not have the constitutional right to control her own body, and that that right belongs not to her, but to the politicians in her state government. How crazy is that? How insulting and demeaning is that? How hypocritical is that? You know, as a U.S. Senator, I hear every day from my Republican colleagues as to how they believe in small government, how we've got to get the government off the backs of the American people, how Americans should be free to make their own basic decisions, not the government. Yeah, except apparently when it comes to a woman's decision with regard to whether or not she will have an abortion. Now, I wish I could tell you that this anti-woman mentality is limited to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it is not. There are leading Republicans in Congress who think the Supreme Court decision did not go far enough. They not only support draconian state legislation on abortion, they want national legislation that will limit abortion rights in every state in this country. And then, my friends, there is the unprecedented attacks we see every day against the very foundations of American democracy, led by former President Donald Trump. Living in a democracy means, among many other things, that you have to abide by the rules. You can't make them up as you go along. And in a democracy, you sometimes win elections, and sometimes you lose elections. According to election officials in every state, Democratic and Republican, and made clear in over 60 cases where his lawyers were defeated in court, Donald Trump lost the 2020 presidential election to Joe Biden. But yet, Trump refused to concede and persists with the big lie that the election was stolen from him and that he actually won. Just this past month at a rally in Ohio, Trump and his team made overt references to a conspiracy theory that he will soon be reinstated as president. I don't think so. And now in 35 states, 17 Republicans are running for Secretary of State or for governor after denying the 2020 election results, seeking to overturn them or refusing to affirm the outcome. Even more have refused to condemn Trump's big lie or amplified theories that the election was stolen. Frighteningly, unbelievably, there were 147 Republican members of Congress who refused to certify the election results. So let's be clear. The big lie is now an official Republican Party position. Respect for authoritarian leaders like Viktor Orban of Hungary is now Republican Party policy. Undermining American democracy is now Republican Party policy. As we enter the last 5 weeks of this midterm campaign, our job is not only to expose Republicans for how they want to move this country backwards. It is equally important that we go on the offensive, that we talk about what has been accomplished in the last 2 years in terms of the American Recovery Plan, a major infrastructure bill, and legislation that will allow over 3 million more veterans to access VA healthcare. All of that is extremely important, but it is not enough. Democrats must now make it clear that they are prepared to take on the powerful corporate interests who dominate Washington, and that Democrats are prepared to fight for the needs of struggling working families. What the American people want and what we must deliver is a government that works for all and not just the people on top. And in my view, here is some, underline some, of what we have got to do. Today, in the wealthiest country on earth, over half of our workers are living paycheck to paycheck, and millions more are falling deeper into debt as they try to survive on starvation wages. Unbelievably, despite huge increases in worker productivity, real inflation accounted for wages are lower today than they were almost 50 years ago. You know why people are angry? More and more worker productivity, and yet it has not kept up with inflation over the last 50 years. We need to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And by the way, today that living wage is more than $15 an hour. No full-time worker in our country should be living in poverty. Further, all workers must be able to exercise their constitutional right to join a union and bargain a fair contract free of intimidation by their employer. With a strong union movement, we can rebuild the middle class of this country. And the good news is that the union movement is growing. More and more people are signing up to be members of unions. And we have got to support those efforts in every step of the way. In terms of healthcare, we need to do what every other major country on earth does, and that is to guarantee healthcare for all as a human right, not a privilege. And the best way to do that is through a Medicare for all single-payer program. We must replace our current private insurance-dominated system, which is wildly inefficient and in which we spend over $12,000 per person, almost twice as much as any other major country. Meanwhile, with the most expensive system in the world, over 85 million Americans are either uninsured or underinsured, and 60,000 people a year die because they don't get to a doctor on time. So let me be clear. The function of a rational healthcare system is not to make insurance companies billions of dollars a year in profit. It is to provide quality care for all. That's what other countries do, and that's what we can and must do. In terms of prescription drugs, we must end the absurdity of paying the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, sometimes 10 times more than the people of other countries for the same exact medicine. It is beyond absurd that 1 out of 4 Americans today cannot afford the prescription drugs that their doctors prescribe. The simplest way to cut prescription drug costs in half in this country is to have Medicare negotiate prices with the industry, something the Veterans Administration has been doing for decades, not a new idea. We must make protecting our children, a major national priority. You have heard it a million times, and it is obviously true. Children are the future of our country. How does it happen, therefore, that in the richest country on earth, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country? disproportionately impacting Black and brown families, and that millions of American children face food insecurity. How does it happen that we are almost the only country on earth not to provide paid family and medical leave? Psychologists have made it abundantly clear that the first 4 years of human life are determinative in shaping our futures. Yet low-income and working-class moms are often forced back to work weeks after giving birth and are denied the opportunity to bond with their babies. How does it happen that at a time when most families now require 2 breadwinners, we have a totally dysfunctional childcare system, a system in which there is a scarcity of slots, a system which is extremely expensive and pays most of its staff totally inadequate wages? How does it happen that in many parts of the country, public schools perform so poorly? Why are so many classrooms overcrowded and teachers underpaid? How does it happen that higher education is unaffordable for many and 45 million have been forced into student debt? We must make public colleges and universities tuition-free, cancel all student debt, and give everybody in this country, regardless of their income or their age, the opportunity to advance to a higher education. Clearly, we need revolutionary changes in how we approach the needs of our children and young adults, including restoring the child tax credit in the American Rescue Plan, which cut childhood poverty in this country by 40%. We cannot continue spending almost $800 billion a year on the military, provide massive tax breaks for the rich and multinational corporations, and then claim that we are just too poor to adequately meet the needs of our children and their parents. We must protect the elderly and disabled. As a society that is rapidly aging, the needs of seniors will become ever more urgent in the coming years. To forestall major crises, we must take action now. Today, half of Americans over 65 are living on incomes of $25,000 or less. Millions of older Americans cannot afford such basic needs as dental care, hearing aids, eyeglasses, or prescription drugs. Social Security benefits must be increased, and luckily we can do that and assure the long-term solvency of Social Security simply by lifting the cap on taxable income for the wealthy. We have to recognize that when somebody making $100 million a year pays the same amount of taxes into Social Security as somebody making $140,000, we have a system that is extremely regressive and unfair to the elderly and the disabled. In order to make sure that Social Security is solvent for the long term, we must address desperate shortages in senior housing, assisted living facilities, and nursing homes by renewing our commitment to home care. That is what seniors need. When we know that millions of elderly and disabled people would prefer to live out their lives with loved ones at home, we have got to give them that option, just as we have to pay a living wage to the people who provide their care. And something that all of you know is that communities all across this country are facing a major housing crisis. While the cost of housing is soaring, some 600,000 Americans are homeless and millions more teeter on the precipice, as nearly 18 million households are spending 50% or more of their limited incomes on housing. Not only should we build millions of units of low-income and affordable housing, we also need to greatly expand concepts like community land trusts, which keep housing perpetually affordable. We should also support those communities that want to move forward with rent control to protect their tenants. And here's another issue that doesn't get anywhere near the attention that it deserves. And that is, today, the ownership of our economy is more concentrated than at any time in the modern history of this country. A handful of giant corporations control what is produced and how much we pay for their products. Just 3 Wall Street firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, control assets of over $20 trillion and are the major stockholders in 96% of S&P 500 companies. We are told every day that the American economy is based on free enterprise and competition. That's a lie. Today, our economy is dominated by a handful of huge multinational corporations that enjoy astronomical profits, engage in price gouging on a regular basis, and exert enormous influence over our political life. This is uber capitalism on steroids. This is dangerous, and it must be ended. Neither Democratic administrations nor Republican administrations have had the courage to break them up. But that is exactly what we must do in order to create the kind of economy that works for ordinary people. Today, despite massive income and wealth inequality, the wealthiest people and most profitable corporations in this country refuse to pay their fair share of taxes. And the federal government lets them get away with it. It is unacceptable that billionaires now pay a lower effective federal income tax rate than nurses, firefighters, and construction workers, and that in any given year, many of our large profitable corporations pay 0 in federal taxes. We need a tax system that is based on ability to pay, that raises the funds we need to support strong social programs for working people, children, and the elderly. We need to move aggressively against a grotesque level of income and wealth inequality by creating a truly progressive tax on wealth. That is what we mean by a progressive agenda. What we mean is bringing people together to fight for a government that works for all of us, not one that works for the people on top. And right now, our job is to rally the American people to make sure that we expand the slim Democratic majority in the House and elect at least 2 more Democrats in the Senate who are prepared to take on the greed of the billionaire class and create a government that works for all of us and not just the 1%. If we stand united, if we do not allow Republicans to divide us up by the color of our skin, our sexual orientation, or our immigration status, if we stand together and take on the big money interest and the unprecedented level of corporate greed in America today, there is nothing that we cannot accomplish. Our job now is to knock on doors, make phone calls, talk to our neighbors, our friends, and our colleagues to get out the vote for progressives and Democrats up and down the ballot. This is something we can do. It is something we must do. The future of the country is at stake. Thank you all very much.